The storm's stranger. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the world into a hazy blur of neon and darkness. From the top floor of Langford Enterprises, the city below shimmered like a restless sea of light, cars cutting through the storm like silver fish in dark water. Ethan Langford ran a hand through his neatly styled hair, his reflection staring back at him from the towering glass windows of his office. It was late, far later than he had intended to stay. But late nights had become his norm. They were predictable, controlled, and free from the chaos of people. He exhaled, rolling his stiff shoulders before shutting his laptop. His office was a temple of precision. Black marble desk, sleek leather chairs, minimalist decor. No family pictures. No clutter. Just control. Grabbing his coat, he strode out of the office, his Italian leather shoes making no sound against the pristine floors. The lobby was empty, the usual hum of the day replaced by an eerie silence. His driver, Wallace, would already be waiting downstairs, the Rolls-Royce's engine purring in anticipation. The moment he stepped outside, the storm hit him like a force of nature. Wind howled, yanking at his coat as he flipped open his umbrella with a practiced flick. The parking lot was a wet mirror, reflecting the towering building behind him, broken only by the distant glow of streetlights. And that was when he saw her. A lone figure stood at the far end of the lot, barely visible through the rain. His steps faltered. She was drenched, her coat hanging off her frail frame like dead weight. Her hair, plastered to her face, made it impossible to see her features clearly. Yet there was something about her posture, rigid, yet expectant, like she had been waiting. A strange unease settled in his chest. Normally, he wouldn't have paid attention. He had seen beggars before, drifters wandering too close to the high-rise buildings, seeking shelter from the storm. Security usually handled them before they even got this close. But she wasn't just some random vagrant. She was staring at him. Not at the car, not at the building. Him. Her gaze was unshaken, piercing, like she knew him. Wallace cleared his throat beside him. "Sir, should I?" Ethan barely registered his words. His instincts, the same ones that had helped him navigate ruthless boardrooms and multimillion-dollar deals, told him to walk away, to step into the warmth of his car and never think of this woman again. But for some reason, his feet didn't move. Instead, he did something he never would have imagined himself doing. He stepped forward. Rain lashed against his coat, soaking his sleeves as he moved closer. The woman didn't flinch. She stood still, her shoulders trembling but her gaze never leaving his. When he was only a few feet away, he stopped. "Are you lost?" His voice was firm, measured. The woman shivered violently, but her lips curled into something resembling a smile. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that carried the weight of something broken. "I found you," she whispered. Ethan stiffened. Her voice, it was hoarse, raw, and yet there was something familiar about it. "I don't," he started to say, but she interrupted him. "You're mine." The word sent an icy chill down his spine. "What?" "You're mine." Her voice cracked, but the conviction in it was unshaken. "You don't remember me." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. The way she spoke, the way she looked at him, it wasn't the desperate plea of a stranger looking for a handout. It was something deeper, darker. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to call security, to pretend none of this was happening. And yet, "What's your name?" he found himself asking. The woman's lips trembled. "Anna. Just Anna." A cold gust of wind tore through the parking lot, rattling the street signs. Wallace was still standing by the car, watching with the tense posture of a man ready to intervene. Ethan forced himself to focus. "Do I know you?" A bitter laugh escaped her, though it sounded more like a sob. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered. "I knew you before you ever knew yourself." He clenched his jaw. "That doesn't make sense." Her watery eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then, with a shaking hand, she reached into her coat pocket. Ethan instinctively took a step back, his muscles tensing. But what she pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a small, faded object. A photograph. She held it out to him. Against every rational thought in his mind, he took it. His breath hitched. It was old, edges curled with time. The colors faded, but the image was clear. A woman, young and full of life, holding a small boy in her arms. The boy had dark curls and wide, mischievous eyes. A stuffed bear was clutched tightly to his chest. Leo. Ethan's fingers gripped the photograph harder. This was him. And the woman holding him, the woman kissing his forehead with infinite tenderness. It was her. His heart slammed against his ribs. His mind rejected the possibility. It wasn't possible, because that woman was his mother, and his mother had died 23 years ago. Ethan staggered back, the rain feeling like needles against his skin. No, this was a scam. This was some cruel trick. His voice was barely above a whisper. Who are you? The woman, Anna, stared at him with eyes that carried decades of sorrow. I am your mother. Lightning split the sky, illuminating her face for the briefest of moments. And for the first time in 23 years, Ethan Langford felt like a child again. Lost, confused, and utterly terrified of the truth. The woman who knew too much. For a long moment, Ethan could only hear the rain. It pounded against the glass windows of the towering Langford Enterprises building, a relentless drumbeat matching the wild thrum of his own heartbeat. The world around him, the car, Wallace, the distant honking of a city that never truly slept, blurred into insignificance. All he could see was her, Anna, the woman who had just uttered an impossibility. I am your mother. The words didn't belong in reality. They were absurd, insulting. And yet, they refused to leave his mind. A gust of wind swept through the parking lot, carrying the scent of wet pavement and city smoke. Ethan clenched the photograph so tightly that the edges bent beneath his fingers. Sir, Wallace's voice cut through the storm. Shall I call security? Ethan forced himself to breathe. He needed a second, a moment to think. Finally, he looked back at the woman. She was shivering, soaked to the bone. Yet she wasn't pleading or demanding. She simply watched him, waiting for him to see her. He should leave. He should. But instead, he said, come inside. Wallace inhaled sharply but didn't question him. Without another word, Ethan turned and led the woman back toward the towering glass entrance of the Langford building. She followed without hesitation. The moment they stepped inside, warmth wrapped around them. The grand lobby stretched in sleek, polished elegance. Black marble floors, dim golden lighting, modern abstract art on the walls. Everything screamed wealth and control. A stark contrast to the frail woman dripping water onto the pristine floor. Wallace shut the glass doors behind them, sealing the storm outside. Ethan turned to face her. Sit. Anna hesitated but finally sank into one of the plush leather chairs near the fireplace. Wallace, ever the efficient man, handed her a towel, but she barely reacted. Her gaze was locked on Ethan, as if she were memorizing every detail of him. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his damp hair. His mind was a battlefield of logic and disbelief. This woman was not his mother. His mother had died. He had been told she had died. And yet, he clenched the photograph tighter. I don't know who you are, he said finally, his voice calm but firm. But you're not my mother. Anna's lips trembled. You don't remember me. He scoffed. You think I'd forget my own mother? Her gaze softened with something that almost looked like pain. You didn't forget. They made you forget. Ethan stiffened. What does that mean? She hesitated, her fingers twisting together in her lap. It means I was taken from you. A muscle ticked in his jaw. This is insane, he muttered, rubbing his temples. She suddenly leaned forward, her voice quiet but urgent. Your father told you I died, didn't he? Ethan froze. A cold, sinking feeling crept into his stomach. She said it so certainly. Not as a guess, not as a question, as if she knew. His throat felt dry. Everyone knows that. My mother died in a car accident. There was a funeral. I was there. Anna inhaled sharply, gripping the edges of the towel in her lap. Did you see the accident? Ethan frowned. What? Her eyes were dark, pleading. Did you see the crash? The body? He blinked, caught off guard by the question. No, he hadn't. He had been a child. Only 7. He remembered crying, confusion, his father's cold silence as they attended a funeral where a casket was lowered into the ground. But he hadn't seen her. He had only ever known what he was told. Ethan took a sharp step back, as if the space between them could keep the truth from creeping closer. You're lying, he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it should have had. Anna exhaled shakily. I wish I was. The room felt suffocating. The walls, the perfectly curated warmth, the silent hum of wealth. It all suddenly felt wrong. Ethan turned away, running a hand down his face. This is a scam, he said, his voice colder now. You think you can come here, throw around some childhood details, and I'll hand you money. I don't want money, she said immediately. He turned sharply. Then what do you want? She swallowed hard. I wanted to see you. Silence stretched between them. Something flickered across her face, something raw, desperate, aching. I've watched you from afar for years, she whispered. I never thought I'd get this close, but when I saw you tonight, I couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. Ethan's jaw clenched. The idea of someone watching him, knowing him from a distance without his knowledge, it sent a shudder through him. And yet, why wasn't he throwing her out? Why did part of him want to believe her? Wallace cleared his throat. Sir, do you need me to? Leave us, Ethan said without looking away from Anna. Wallace hesitated. Sir, leave. A brief pause. Then, with a small nod, Wallace disappeared down the hall. The moment they were alone, Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward. You said my father lied to me. His voice was ice. Why? Anna looked up at him, her entire body trembling. Because if he had told you the truth, she inhaled shakily, you would have looked for me. Ethan's stomach twisted. I don't believe you, he said, though the words felt hollow. Anna's voice softened. You don't have to. She reached into her coat again, and this time, she pulled out something small and metallic. A locket. Ethan's breath hitched the moment he saw it. It was old, worn from time. But he knew it instantly. His fingers twitched as she placed it on the table between them. With slow, careful movements, he picked it up and flipped it open. Inside was a tiny photograph. A boy, laughing, curled up in the arms of a woman with dark curls. His mother. And on the other side, his name. Ethan Alexander Langford. His mother had given him this locket when he was 6. He had lost it the year she died. And now, his grip tightened around the metal. Everything, his father, his past, his truth, suddenly felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Pieces that only this woman seemed to have. His breath was unsteady when he finally spoke. What really happened to you? Anna's lips trembled. The truth, she whispered, is darker than you think. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The cracks in the past. The locket felt heavy in Ethan's hand, far heavier than it should. The weight of it wasn't in the metal, but in the history it carried. In the memories it threatened to unearth. He had lost this locket 23 years ago, and now it sat in his palm, cold against his skin, offered to him by a woman who had just shattered everything he thought he knew. His mother was dead. That was a fact. That was what he had been told. That was the truth he had built his entire life upon. But if she was dead, then who was this woman sitting in front of him? Anna sat quietly, her frail hands folded together in her lap, watching him with an expression so full of sorrow and longing that it made his stomach twist. Ethan clenched his jaw. This isn't real. This isn't happening. His father had told him the truth. He had no reason to lie. Did he? A storm raged outside, but the real storm was within him. He turned sharply, his movements stiff, calculated. This doesn't prove anything. Anna exhaled, her gaze lowering. I know it doesn't. His grip on the locket tightened. Where did you get this? She hesitated. You left it behind. Ethan's patience was wearing thin. Behind where? She looked up, her gaze piercing. The night they took me. Silence. The words slammed into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. Took me. Ethan forced out a breath, shaking his head. You're lying. I wish I was, she whispered. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped him. Do you even hear yourself? This is insane. You're telling me that my father, lied to me my entire life. That he staged my mother's death. And what? Locked you away. Anna's lips trembled. He didn't lock me away. Ethan scoffed. Then what? She swallowed hard. He banished me. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The word was spoken so softly, yet it held so much weight. His mother, this woman, was claiming that his father had erased her, that he had removed her from his life, as if she had never existed. Ethan shook his head, pacing toward the large floor-to-ceiling windows. His reflection stared back at him, composed, cold. A man who controlled everything. But right now, he felt like he was losing control. You need to leave, he said, turning back to face her. Anna's eyes flashed with pain, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded, rising to her feet with a quiet, almost resigned grace. Ethan expected her to plead, to cry, to beg. But she did none of that. She just looked at him, like she was memorizing his face one last time, like she had always known this would be how it ended. She stepped past him, her fragile frame barely making a sound against the marble floor. But just before she reached the doors, she paused. I used to hum you to sleep, she said quietly. Ethan stiffened. You never liked lullabies. You thought they were childish, but you loved music. So, I hummed. Her voice was distant, lost in memory. Your favorite was the one about the silver moon. I don't think you ever knew the words. But every night when I hummed, you would close your eyes and fall asleep within minutes. Ethan's chest tightened. She turned to look at him, tears brimming in her eyes. I bet you don't even remember it now. Ethan did remember. His father had told him that it was a dream, a false memory. That he must have heard it in a movie, or maybe from a nanny. But hearing Anna say it now, with such certainty, it felt real. The ground beneath him felt unsteady. Then, Anna whispered, I never stopped humming, Ethan. Even when they took me away, I kept humming, hoping that somehow you'd hear me. His throat tightened. Anna blinked rapidly, brushing a tear from her cheek. She turned back toward the door. But before she could take another step, wait. The word was out before Ethan could stop himself. Anna froze. Ethan didn't know why he said it. His mind screamed at him to let her leave, to forget this night, to go back to his structured, controlled life. But something deep inside him, something buried and long forgotten, refused to let her go. Tell me everything, he said hoarsely. Anna turned to face him fully, searching his face for something. And then, for the first time that night, she smiled. It was a sad smile, a broken smile. But it was real. And Ethan knew, whether he was ready for it or not, his life was about to change forever. The truth buried in shadows. Ethan had spent his entire life mastering control. Control over his company, his employees, his emotions. Every decision he made was calculated, precise. He had built walls so high that no one, not even himself, could question the life he had so carefully constructed. And yet, Here he was, standing across from a woman who claimed to be his dead mother, his carefully structured world crumbling with every word she spoke. He shouldn't have asked her to stay. He should have let her leave, pretended this night never happened. But it was too late, because deep inside, something had already begun to crack. Anna sat in front of the fireplace, wrapped in the towel Wallace had given her. The heat from the flames bathed her in a golden glow, making the lines on her face more pronounced, the evidence of years that had not been kind. Ethan sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees, fingers interlocked. His expression was unreadable, but his mind was a battlefield. "Start from the beginning," he said finally. Anna inhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. "The beginning," she repeated, almost to herself. "I suppose it starts with him." Ethan didn't need her to say the name. He already knew. Richard Langford. His father. The man who raised him. The man who built an empire from the ground up. The man who had always been distant, always cold, but never cruel. At least, not in the way she was suggesting. Anna's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the towel around her shoulders. "Your father and I. We were never supposed to be together." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard. "I wasn't from his world. I was nobody. Just a girl from the wrong side of the city." Her lips curved into a small, sad smile. "But Richard, he was different back then. He was charming. He made me believe that love could conquer anything." Ethan didn't move, but his jaw tightened. Anna continued, her voice distant. "We were young, reckless, and when I got pregnant with you, he changed." She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "I thought he would be happy, but instead, he was terrified." Ethan frowned. "Terrified of what?" "Of you," she whispered. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "That doesn't make sense." Anna met his gaze, eyes filled with old sorrow. "To him, you weren't just a child. You were an inheritance, a legacy, and a weakness." Ethan remained silent, processing her words. "Richard had ambitions far greater than family," she said. "He was building his empire, making connections with powerful men who saw emotions as liabilities. To them, a wife and child were nothing more than distractions." She clenched her fists in her lap. "So, he made a choice." Ethan inhaled sharply. Anna's voice shook, but she forced herself to continue. "At first, it was small things. He distanced himself from us, spent more time at work. When you were born, he barely came home." Her lips pressed together. "Then one day, he told me he had made arrangements for me to leave." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. "Leave?" Anna's expression darkened. "He wanted me gone. But he couldn't just divorce me. Not without it making headlines, not without damaging his reputation." She exhaled shakily. "So he did something far worse." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. "What did he do?" Anna looked at him, and for a moment, she seemed to struggle to find the words. Then she said, "He erased me." A heavy silence filled the room. Ethan's body went rigid. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that," Anna whispered. "One day, I was your mother. And the next, I simply wasn't." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Richard made me disappear. He had power, influence. He controlled the narrative. He told the world that I had died in a car accident, a closed casket funeral. No questions asked." Ethan's stomach twisted painfully. No, this couldn't be true. His father had told him about the accident. He remembered the funeral. But did he? He frowned, trying to recall any clear memories of that day. The people, the coffin, the burial. But all he could remember was being told what had happened. Anna's voice was barely above a whisper. "I fought. I tried to come back to you. But I was up against a man who had the entire world in his pocket, and he made sure I never saw you again." Ethan shook his head, forcing out a bitter laugh. "And I'm supposed to believe this? That my father, a businessman, not some crime lord, erased you from existence. Anna swallowed hard. Believe what you want. But tell me this. She leaned forward, her gaze locking onto his. When was the last time you heard your father say my name? Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then froze. A sharp, unsettling realization settled over him. His father had never said her name. Not once. Not even when Ethan was young, when he asked about her. Richard Langford always spoke in cold, measured statements. She's gone, Ethan. Don't dwell on the past. Move forward. Never Anna. Never your mother. Just an empty absence. A lie wrapped in silence. Ethan's breath came shallow. Anna saw the shift in his expression, and her own gaze softened. You feel it now, don't you? His hands curled into fists. Why now? He demanded, his voice sharp, desperate. If you've been alive all this time, why come back now? Anna exhaled. Because Richard is dying. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Anna watched him carefully. He doesn't have the power he once did. His reach is fading. And for the first time in over 2 decades, her lips trembled. I had a chance to see you again. Ethan felt like the ground beneath him was shattering. The father he had trusted, the truth he had believed, had it all been a carefully constructed lie? Anna hesitated before whispering, I don't expect you to believe me overnight, but I had to try. She stood slowly, her frail frame swaying slightly. I just wanted you to know. Ethan should have let her leave. He should have let this conversation end. But instead, his voice cut through the silence. You said my father erased you. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. So how did you survive? Anna's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected the question. Then she whispered, because someone helped me. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine, and in that moment he realized this story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Shadows of the past. Ethan felt like he was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down into a darkness he wasn't sure he could climb out of. His entire life had been built on the foundation of certainty. His father was a powerful man. His mother had died, and he had been raised to take his place at the helm of Langford Enterprises. But now, that foundation was cracking. His mother, his real mother, sat before him, her frail hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes full of truths he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. But he needed to hear them. You said someone helped you. Ethan said, his voice low, measured. Who? Anna hesitated. Her gaze flickered to the fire, as if searching for the answer in the dancing flames. Then she whispered, your uncle. Ethan's breath caught. My uncle? He repeated slowly. I don't have an uncle. Anna let out a small, bitter laugh. No, you don't. Not anymore. Ethan clenched his jaw. Richard Langford had never mentioned a brother. In fact, Ethan had never once heard of any living relatives beyond his father. It was always just the two of them. Until now. Anna exhaled. His name was Daniel Langford. He was Richard's younger brother. And once upon a time, he was your favorite person in the world. Ethan's head spun. A brother. His father had a brother. How? His voice was tight. How is that possible? How have I never heard of him? Anna's expression darkened. Because your father made sure you wouldn't. Ethan's stomach twisted. Anna continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel and Richard were nothing alike. Richard was always the strategist, the businessman, the one with ambition. Daniel, he had heart. He never wanted power or wealth. He just wanted a family. A sad smile touched her lips. And he loved you, Ethan. He adored you in a way your father never could. When Richard distanced himself from us, Daniel stepped in. He was the one who took you to the park, taught you how to ride a bike. You don't remember, do you? Ethan's breath came unevenly. He didn't remember. But there was something, faint, like a whisper from a dream. A deep voice, laughter, strong arms lifting him onto a bicycle. Had that been Daniel? Anna swallowed hard. When Richard decided I was a liability, Daniel fought for me. He tried to stop him. He threatened to go public, to expose everything. She let out a shaky breath. And for that, Richard destroyed him. Ethan's pulse pounded. What do you mean? He made Daniel disappear, Anna said, her voice hollow, just like he did to me. A heavy silence filled the room. Ethan ran a hand down his face. You're telling me my father didn't just erase you. He erased his own brother. Anna nodded. Ethan's stomach twisted violently. His father was ruthless in business. But this was something else. How? Ethan asked, his voice sharp. Anna inhaled shakily. Richard framed him, accused him of fraud, embezzlement, had evidence planted, paid off judges. Within months, Daniel was ruined. His name was wiped from company records, and his assets were frozen. He was forced to leave the city with nothing. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. And then, he pressed. Anna's lips trembled. Then he disappeared. I never saw him again. Ethan sat in stunned silence. A brother he never knew. A family he never had. His father had controlled every aspect of his life, even the things he didn't remember. And now, the past was unraveling before him like a thread pulled loose from a tapestry. Ethan's voice was quiet but firm. Where is he now? Anna shook her head. I don't know. I've spent years searching, but it's like he vanished. Ethan's mind raced. If what Anna was saying was true, then there was only one person who could confirm it. His father. Richard Langford was in the final stages of his life, confined to a hospital bed, his empire slowly slipping from his grasp. Ethan had barely seen him in the past few months, their relationship reduced to cold conversations and business updates. But now he had questions. Ethan stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. I need to see him. Anna looked up, alarmed. Ethan. I have to know. He cut in, his voice sharp. If you're telling the truth, then he's the only one who can confirm it. Anna's eyes darkened. And if he lies? Ethan exhaled harshly. Then I'll know what kind of man he really is. A long silence stretched between them. Then Anna did something unexpected. She reached forward, hesitated for only a second, then touched his hand. Her skin was cool, fragile. I don't want you to hate him, she whispered. Ethan frowned. Why not? She smiled sadly. Because I already did that for you. Ethan swallowed hard. He pulled his hand away, nodding stiffly. I'll find out the truth. And with that, he turned and walked out the door, his mind burning with questions that only one man could answer. Confronting the truth. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet suffering. Dim lights lined the long corridors, their glow barely reaching the edges of the tiled floor. The storm that had raged outside followed Ethan into the sterile halls, not in the form of wind and rain, but in the turmoil burning inside him. Richard Langford was dying. The once mighty patriarch, a man who had shaped Ethan's life with an iron grip, now lay wasting away in a private hospital suite, his body failing, his mind still sharp but caged within a deteriorating vessel. Ethan stepped into the room. The air was thick with the low hum of medical equipment. Machines beeped softly, measuring the final days of the man who had controlled everything, except death itself. Richard lay in the bed, thin and frail. His once commanding presence was reduced to sunken eyes and papery skin stretched over prominent cheekbones. Yet when his gaze met Ethan's, there was still something unyielding in them. Ethan. His father's voice was hoarse, a whisper of its former strength. You came. Ethan pulled up a chair, his movements measured. He sat, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan exhaled sharply. Did you think I wouldn't? A small smirk twitched at Richard's lips. I had my doubts. Ethan studied him. There was something unnatural about seeing his father so weak. All his life, Richard had been an untouchable force, invincible, unstoppable. Now, he was human, a dying man with nothing left to hide behind. Ethan leaned forward. "Tell me about Daniel." Richard's smirk faltered. His expression darkened. Ethan didn't blink. "You never mentioned him." "Not once. I had to hear it from her." Richard closed his eyes briefly, then let out a slow breath. "So, she found you." Ethan clenched his jaw. "That's all you have to say?" Richard opened his eyes again, locking onto his son's. "What did she tell you?" Ethan's stomach twisted. He expected denial, maybe even outrage. But Richard's voice carried something else. Resignation. "She told me the truth," Ethan said, his voice low. "That you erased her. That you erased him." A silence stretched between them. Then Richard said, "You weren't supposed to know." Ethan's pulse pounded. He's not denying it. His fingers curled into fists. "So it's true." Richard exhaled sharply, his breathing strained. He turned his gaze toward the ceiling, as if searching for something among the white tiles. "Your mother was a complication," he said finally. "She didn't belong in my world. I told myself that she would adapt, that she'd grow into the life I had built. But she was soft." His voice tightened. "Too soft." Ethan's jaw clenched. "She loved me." Richard's gaze snapped back to him. And that was the problem. Ethan recoiled slightly. "What?" Richard's breathing was labored, but his voice carried a weight that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Love makes men weak, Ethan. I built an empire by making the hard choices. I couldn't afford to be weak." Ethan's stomach twisted in disgust. "So you got rid of her," he spat, "like she was nothing." Richard didn't flinch. "I gave her a choice." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "A choice?" Richard's expression remained impassive. "She could have stayed, but she wanted you to have a different life. A simpler one. One where you didn't grow up under the weight of expectations. She thought if she left, I would let her take you with her." He shook his head. "That was never going to happen." Ethan's breath was uneven. "You told me she died." Richard's expression flickered with something unreadable. It was easier that way. Ethan wanted to scream. His entire life, every painful memory, every lonely night, every time he had wished for a mother's presence, it had all been because of him. His father hadn't lost his wife. He had cast her out. Ethan's hands trembled as he forced himself to ask the next question. "And Daniel?" Richard's face darkened. He should have stayed out of it. Ethan's blood ran cold. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where is he?" Richard looked away. Ethan grabbed the railing of the hospital bed. "Where is he?" His father turned his gaze back to him, and for the first time, Ethan saw something there that he had never seen before. Regret. "I don't know," Richard admitted. His voice was strained, rough with something dangerously close to guilt. "I destroyed his name, took everything from him. He disappeared after that. Maybe he ran. Maybe he trailed off." Ethan's breath hitched. Maybe he didn't survive. The thought was like a knife to the gut. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. His entire body felt numb. Anna was right. She was right about everything. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze locked on the frail man before him. "You took everything from me," he said, his voice quiet, dangerous. "You stole my mother. You erased my uncle. And for what? A legacy?" Richard didn't answer. Ethan stood, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "For the first time in your life," he said coldly, "you have no control." His father's lips parted slightly, his breathing labored. Ethan turned toward the door. But just as he reached it, Richard's voice stopped him. "Ethan." He paused but didn't turn around. There was a long silence. Then, in the weakest voice Ethan had ever heard from him, his father whispered, "I'm sorry." Ethan closed his eyes. For a second, he thought about responding, about turning around, about trying to reconcile the love he once had for this man with the monster he had become. But he didn't. He walked out, leaving his father behind, leaving the past behind. But as he stepped into the hallway, his mind was already made up. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. He was going to find Daniel. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Langford was going to uncover the truth for himself. The search for the forgotten. Ethan Langford had spent his entire life chasing power, control, and the unattainable perfection his father had demanded of him. But now he was chasing the truth. The hospital's cold corridors stretched before him, but his mind was already elsewhere, piecing together the fractured past, following the threads of a life he had never known existed. His mother had been erased. His uncle had been destroyed. And yet, somewhere in the vast web of lies his father had spun, Daniel Langford was still out there, waiting to be found. 1 week later, Ethan had never realized how deep his father's reach had been until he started searching for Daniel. There were no official records of him past a certain date, nothing beyond a decade-old scandal that had been neatly buried under legal proceedings and financial ruin. No addresses, no social security activity, no paper trail. It was as if Daniel had never existed. But Ethan wasn't giving up. His private investigator, Mason Grant, a former journalist turned information broker, sat across from him in Ethan's penthouse office, sifting through files spread across the polished glass desk. "It's like looking for a ghost," Mason muttered, flipping through old newspaper clippings. "After your father accused him of fraud, he vanished. No phone records, no bank accounts. If he's alive, he's living completely off the grid." Ethan leaned back, his fingers steepled. "People don't just disappear." Mason smirked. "Your father made sure he did." Ethan exhaled sharply. The weight of it all was suffocating. His father's death was imminent. Any day now, Richard Langford would take his secrets to the grave. And Ethan had to find Daniel before that happened, before it was too late. Mason tapped a finger against a grainy surveillance photo from a decade ago. A man, taller than Richard, leaner, his face shadowed, walking through a crowded train station. It was the last confirmed sighting of Daniel Langford. "Where was this taken?" Ethan asked. "Chicago," Mason said. "But that was years ago. If he was running, he wouldn't have stayed in one place." Ethan narrowed his eyes at the image. Something about it bothered him. He reached for the photo, his sharp gaze scanning the background, the rush of travelers, the blurred signs, the distorted reflection in the station's glass windows. Then he saw it. A second figure, a woman, standing just behind Daniel, almost out of frame. Ethan's breath caught. The curve of her jaw, the strands of dark hair falling over her face. His mother. His grip on the photo tightened. She was with him. Mason leaned in, frowning. "What?" Ethan tapped the image. "Anna. She was with him. All this time, she said she never saw him again. But this says otherwise." Mason's lips parted slightly. "So she lied to you?" Ethan's stomach twisted. Had she? Or had she been protecting something bigger? He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. "Find me the last person who saw Daniel," he ordered. Mason arched a brow. "And where will you be?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Getting answers. The confrontation. The old apartment was tucked away in the quieter part of the city, far from the steel towers and penthouse offices Ethan was used to. The streets smelled of rain and old pavement, the dim glow of streetlights barely illuminating the sidewalk. Anna lived here. Not in some abandoned shack, not on the streets. Here, in a modest apartment. Not rich, not desperate, just hidden. Ethan knocked. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, the door creaked open. Anna stood there, her expression unreadable. She didn't look surprised to see him. "I was wondering when you'd come," she murmured. Ethan stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The apartment was small, but warm. Lived in. Too normal for someone who had supposedly been erased. He turned to face her. "Tell me the truth." Anna sighed, shutting the door. I did tell you the truth. No, you told me part of it, Ethan countered. He held up the photo. You saw Daniel. You were with him. Anna's breath hitched, but she didn't deny it. Ethan's voice was sharp. Why didn't you tell me? Anna hesitated. Then she sat down on the worn-out couch, staring at the photograph like it was a wound she had tried to forget. Because he told me not to. Ethan stiffened. Why? She looked up at him, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite place. Because he doesn't want to be found. The room fell into silence. Ethan's mind raced. That doesn't make sense. Anna exhaled. Yes, it does. She ran a hand through her graying hair. Your uncle. He was a good man. He loved you. But after what your father did to him, he realized something. Ethan's hands curled into fists. What? Anna's eyes darkened. That as long as Richard Langford was alive, being in your life would put you in danger. Ethan's pulse pounded. His uncle hadn't just disappeared. He had chosen to protect him. Anna swallowed hard. He begged me to stay hidden, to let you live your life without looking for ghosts. Ethan felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. Where is he now? His voice was low, dangerous. Anna looked away. I don't know. Ethan stepped closer. You're lying. Tears brimmed in Anna's eyes. No, Ethan. I truly don't know. The last time I saw him was 10 years ago. He told me he was leaving, that he had to disappear completely. Ethan clenched his jaw. But then Anna whispered something that made his blood run cold. He said, if Ethan ever finds out the truth, tell him I'm waiting where the past ended. Ethan's breath hitched. What does that mean? Anna shook her head. I don't know, but he said you'd understand. Ethan frowned, his mind racing. Where the past ended, memories surfaced, faint, distant. Then, a flash of memory. A cabin, nestled deep in the woods. His childhood, laughter, campfires, Daniel's voice telling stories under the stars. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew where his uncle was. He turned to Anna, his eyes blazing with resolve. I'm going to find him. Anna's lips trembled, but she nodded. Ethan didn't hesitate. He walked out the door. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing power. He wasn't chasing wealth. He was chasing family. And he was never letting it go again.